What if I told you the next global financial crisis has already begun? You just don't see it yet, because this time it won't start with reckless bankers or a housing collapse. It will start with the very institutions that were supposed to prevent collapse: central banks. For more than a century, they've called themselves the guardians of stability, the firefighters of the economy. But what if the firefighters are now the arsonists? What if the same decisions that saved us before are quietly creating the next disaster? And what if by the time we notice, it's already too late? To understand how we got here, we need to go back to when money itself was fragile. In the early 1900s, banking was chaos. When a bank failed, depositors lost everything. The panic of 1907 changed everything. Markets collapsed, and J.P. Morgan used his own fortune to stop the bleeding. That crisis terrified governments. They realized an entire economy couldn't depend on one man's wealth. So in 1913, the Federal Reserve was born. Its mission: to stabilize prices, regulate currency, and make sure financial disasters would never happen again. But they did, again and again. Other nations followed suit: Britain, Japan, Europe, each building central banks to tame the chaos of capitalism. It sounded rational, but they were about to discover that too much control creates its own kind of chaos. At first, central banks had a simple role: manage gold, regulate currency, and keep inflation stable. Then came war. World War I forced governments to spend far more than they had. So they printed money, and the central banks helped. That partnership between governments and central banks changed everything. After the Great Depression and World War II, central banks weren't just money managers anymore. They were the architects of recovery. Then came 1971. President Nixon ended the gold standard, and the dollar became backed by nothing but trust. Money was no longer a physical promise. It was an idea, something created at will. From that point on, central banks didn't just influence economies, they controlled them. They could print money from nothing, cut interest rates to zero, and prop up entire markets with the push of a button. The era of monetary dominance had begun, but every new power comes with a price. Every crisis gave central banks a new reason to intervene, and each intervention made the system more fragile. 1987, Black Monday. Markets crashed, the Fed flooded money into the system, and recovery came fast. But that cheap money fueled the next bubble. The 1990s tech boom followed, then the dot-com crash. The response? Lower rates again. And that set the stage for 2008. Easy credit inflated housing, banks gorged on risky debt. When it all collapsed, the system nearly died. The Fed's answer? Zero interest rates, quantitative easing, and trillion-dollar bailouts. It worked, temporarily, but cheap money became the oxygen of the modern economy. Governments overspent, corporations borrowed endlessly. Investors learned one dangerous lesson: the Fed will always save them. That illusion became known as the Fed put, but it wasn't safety, it was dependence. Because when everything relies on cheap money, raising rates becomes lethal. After 2008, central banks couldn't stop printing. Whenever growth slowed, they intervened again. Interest rates stayed near zero for more than a decade. Then came 2020. The pandemic hit, the world shut down, and central banks created more money in 2 years than in the previous century combined. At first, it felt like a miracle. Markets soared, governments borrowed freely. Everyone believed the system was unbreakable. Then the bill arrived. By 2022, inflation exploded to 40-year highs. The same central banks that promised it was temporary were forced to reverse course. They raised rates faster than at any time in modern history. Almost overnight, bonds collapsed, mortgage costs doubled, and banks like Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse imploded. The same cure that saved the patient was now killing it. Today, governments are drowning in debt. The U.S. owes more than $35 trillion, paying over $1 trillion a year just in interest. more than its defense budget. Every rate hike makes that debt harder to pay. Every bond that loses value weakens banks and pensions holding them. Central banks are trapped. If they keep rates high, they risk a global debt crisis. If they cut them, inflation reignites. Either way, the illusion of control is cracking. Global debt has reached an unprecedented $315 trillion. Central banks now own massive amounts of government bonds, effectively funding their own governments. Meanwhile, real wages are falling, savings are shrinking, and living costs keep rising. Something fundamental has broken, and most people don't see it yet. We've seen this before. In the 1920s, cheap money after World War I fueled the Roaring '20s and ended in the Great Depression. In the 1970s, central banks fought inflation too softly, creating a decade of stagflation, high prices, low growth, and anger in the streets. In the 1990s, Japan used easy money to avoid a collapse, only to enter 30 years of stagnation. Every time, the pattern repeats. Cheap money creates bubbles, bubbles burst, and to fix the crash, central banks print even more. It's a cycle that never ends until it does. The next crisis won't look like 2008. It won't be one bank or one bubble. It will be systemic. A slow-motion breakdown where governments can't pay their debts, banks can't absorb their losses, and central banks can't fix it without breaking something else. Signs are already appearing. Bond markets flashing stress, currencies quietly weakening, emerging economies defaulting under dollar pressure. And as technology, automation, and aging populations reshape the world, the old monetary tools no longer work. Central banks are losing control of the story, and when confidence cracks, so does the foundation of money itself. Because money is more than numbers. It's belief, a shared story we all agree to trust. When that story falters, everything built on it trembles. So what can we learn from all this? First, central banks don't erase risk. They delay it. Each rescue plants the seeds of the next crisis. Second, cheap money feels good until it doesn't. It rewards debt and speculation until the reckoning arrives. Third, you can print currency, but you can't print trust. And once trust is gone, no policy can bring it back. The next crisis won't start with panic. It'll start quietly with missed payments, failed bond auctions, and ignored headlines. Then, suddenly, the illusion will shatter. Central banks will step in again. They'll print more, cut rates, and maybe even introduce digital currencies to maintain control. But beneath the surface, nothing will have changed. You can't build real stability on artificial money. So when the system resets, and it will, the question becomes who will write the next chapter? The institutions that caused the crisis or the people who finally understand it? History doesn't repeat, but it always rhymes. And right now, it's whispering a warning. If you've made it this far, you already think differently. You see the patterns most people miss. Don't just watch the markets. Study the history behind them, because money, history, and power are always connected.